Introduction and the atmosphere of medieval winters. Imagine yourself stepping back in time to a village in medieval Europe, somewhere between the 12th and 14th centuries. The seasons were not marked by electric calendars, by thermostats, or by the predictable hum of central heating. Instead, the coming of winter was a slow, creeping change that everyone could feel in their bones. For the medieval peasant, winter was not simply another season. It was a trial, a challenge that tested both the body and the spirit. As autumn waned, the fields, once golden with grain and dotted with vegetables, now lay barren, covered by frost. The sun dipped lower each day, and darkness seemed to swallow the land earlier and earlier. By the time the coldest months arrived, December, January, and February, the village was transformed into a world of ice and silence. The sound of the wind whipping through the trees was constant rattling shutters and seeping through every crack in the wooden walls of cottages. In the Middle Ages, the winter night was a formidable adversary. Peasants had little protection against the cold. Their homes built of timber wattle and daub were poor insulators. Firewood was scarce and precious. For many families, there was not enough to burn through the night. The hearth, the heart of the home, could not always keep away the deep chill that penetrated walls and floors. The peasants went to sleep, knowing that the fire might die before dawn, leaving them vulnerable to the icy breath of winter. It is important to understand just how dangerous the cold was. Hypothermia was not a medical term known to peasants, but the effects were real and feared. Children, the elderly, and the sick were particularly at risk. Stories circulated about families who did not wake up in the morning frozen together in their sleep. The mere act of surviving the night was a victory. The medieval peasants' relationship with winter was also spiritual. They believed that winter was a season of testing given by God. Harsh weather was often interpreted as divine punishment or as a reminder of human frailty. Yet winter also carried its own rhythm of hope. The church calendar was filled with holy days and feasts in December and January occasions to gather, to pray, and to find warmth, not only in fire but also in faith. Now close your eyes and imagine a thatched roof cottage dimly lit by a small fire. Smoke curls lazily upward, escaping through a hole in the roof. Outside, snow blankets the village. The livestock huddle in their pens, their breaths visible in the frigid air. Inside the home, a family of 6 prepares for bed. They are dressed in layers of wool and linen garments patched many times over. They share a single space, parents, children, even a grandparent, all lying close together on straw mats covered with furs. There is no privacy, no comfort as we know it today, but there is survival achieved through closeness and shared warmth. In this first part of our story, we will explore not only the atmosphere of medieval winters, but also the psychological weight of those long nights. For peasants, the cold was more than a physical sensation. It was a constant reminder of vulnerability, of the fine line between life and death. And yet they faced it with remarkable endurance year after year. The atmosphere of a medieval winter night was a mixture of silence and sound, fear and comfort. Silence came when snow fell thick and heavy, muffling every footstep. But there was also sound, the howl of wolves in the distance, the creak of timbers in the wind, the muffled cough of a child trying to sleep. These noises reminded peasants that the world was alive even in its most barren season, and that survival meant listening carefully to both nature and one another. Let us now step deeper into their world. Through description and imagination, you will see, hear, and almost feel the cold that wrapped itself around every medieval peasant cottage. By doing so, you will understand what it truly meant to endure the coldest winter nights without freezing to death. The structure of peasant homes. When imagining the medieval peasant's struggle against the cold, It is essential to begin with the very walls around them, the homes in which they lived. Unlike the grand castles of kings and nobles, peasant dwellings were modest, often crude, and built with the simplest materials available. Yet these homes were the first line of defense against the coldest winter nights, and the ingenuity of peasants in constructing them is a testament to their resilience. Most peasant homes were constructed using a method called wattle and daub. Thin branches woven together like a basket created the wattle framework. This lattice was then smeared with daub, a sticky mixture of clay, straw, mud, and animal dung. When dried, the daub hardened into a solid wall, though hardly airtight. In winter, the wind could whistle through even the smallest cracks. Families often stuffed extra straw or moss into the gaps, trying desperately to keep out the drafts. The roof was usually thatched, bundles of straw or reeds layered thickly to shed rain and snow. Thatch, while abundant and inexpensive, carried its own risks. It could catch fire easily, and during long, wet winters it sometimes sagged or even collapsed under heavy snow. Families would climb onto their roofs to beat the snow away with sticks, a dangerous but necessary winter chore. Floors were typically nothing more than packed earth. On winter nights, the cold of the ground seeped directly into the home. Peasants sometimes spread rushes, straw, or reeds across the floor to provide insulation. This bedding would be changed infrequently, and over time, it collected dirt, crumbs, and insects. Yet it was better than lying directly on frozen soil. A central hearth provided warmth and light, but it was a smoky affair. Many peasant cottages had no chimney. Smoke from the fire filled the single-room dwelling, escaping only through a hole in the roof or through cracks in the thatch. The smoky air stung the eyes and clung to clothes, but it added a measure of insulation. Some historians believe that the soot that built up inside cottages may have actually helped seal small cracks, making homes slightly more resistant to winter drafts. Windows, if they existed at all, were tiny, sometimes just slits in the wall covered with wooden shutters. Glass was a luxury far beyond the reach of peasants. In the coldest months, shutters remained closed, plunging the home into near darkness, except for the glow of the fire. Families sacrificed light in exchange for warmth, however meager it was. The layout of a peasant home was simple, often a single room shared by the entire family. In some regions, families even shared their living quarters with livestock. Cows, goats, or pigs were brought indoors during the winter. This was not only for the animals' survival, but also for the humans. The body heat of animals contributed precious warmth. A cow in the corner of the room was like a living furnace, radiating heat through the night. Of course, this also meant sharing space with the smell and noise of livestock, but survival left little room for comfort. The hearth was the heart of the home. Positioned in the center or along one wall, it was the site of cooking, storytelling, and warmth. Peasants burned whatever fuel they could find: wood, peat, dried dung, even bundles of straw. Firewood was scarce and often rationed. In many villages, laws regulated who could gather wood from the Lord's forests. Cutting down trees without permission could lead to harsh punishment. For peasants, gathering enough fuel for winter was a constant worry. Some collected branches and brushwood months in advance, storing them in piles that dwindled too quickly once the true cold set in. Inside the cottage space was divided not by walls but by function. One area was for sleeping, another for cooking, another for storing tools or food. Privacy was non-existent. Children, parents, and grandparents all shared the same space, huddled together when the nights grew bitter. Furniture was sparse: a table, a few stools, maybe a chest. Beds were often nothing more than wooden frames filled with straw covered by woolen blankets or animal skins. The smell of a medieval peasant's home in winter was unmistakable. Smoke from the fire mixed with the scent of damp straw livestock and unwashed bodies. The air was thick and heavy, yet peasants adapted. To them, this environment was not unpleasant. It was simply home. The warmth of being together, no matter how meager, provided comfort amid the freezing winds outside. Regional variations existed, of course. In Scandinavia, where winters were especially severe, peasants built sturdier log houses with thicker walls. In parts of Germany and Eastern Europe, homes sometimes featured a tile stove, a more efficient heating system. But for the majority of medieval Europe's peasants, their homes were fragile shelters, built with necessity and maintained with constant labor. Despite their simplicity, these homes were more than just physical structures. They represented resilience, community, and adaptation. Every crack sealed with straw, every bundle of wood gathered in autumn, every animal brought inside, all were acts of determination against the cold. And within those walls, under that thatched roof, families lived out their nights in a fragile but enduring shelter. In this part of our story, we see that survival began not with food or clothing, but with the home itself. The peasant cottage was both a shield and a prison, keeping out the cold, but also trapping its occupants in smoky darkness. It was a place where endurance was tested every night, and where the thin line between safety and exposure was measured by the strength of mud walls and the glow of a dwindling fire. Keeping warm at night. If the peasant cottage was the shield, then the methods of keeping warm were the strategies for survival. Once the door was closed, the shutters barred, and the fire sparked to life, the nightly ritual of defending against the cold began. In medieval times, keeping warm was not taken for granted. It required planning, creativity, and often sacrifice. Clothing was the first line of defense. Most peasants wore garments made from wool, the most abundant and practical material available. Wool retained heat even when damp, and though coarse and itchy, it was invaluable during winter. Men wore tunics, trousers, and cloaks, while women wore long woolen dresses with layered shifts and aprons. Children, too, were swaddled in scraps of wool or linen, often wearing hand-me-downs patched and repatched over the years. Nothing was wasted. Every scrap of cloth was reused until it fell apart. On the coldest nights, peasants slept fully dressed, sometimes wearing several layers. Boots were kept on hats, pulled low, and cloaks wrapped tightly around bodies. Gloves or mittens were rare, but peasants improvised with strips of cloth. Covering the head was particularly important as heat escaped quickly. A simple woolen cap could mean the difference between comfort and shivering through the night. Blankets were a luxury, and not every family had enough. Those fortunate enough owned heavy woolen blankets or quilts stuffed with scraps of cloth. Others relied on animal skins, sheepskin, goatskin, or deerskin spread over straw bedding. The warmth of fur against the body was a primal comfort, linking humans to the animals that sustained them. Even dogs or cats, when allowed inside, became living blankets curling up at their master's feet. The bed itself was often little more than a wooden frame filled with straw. Straw, though scratchy, provided insulation from the frozen ground. Families refreshed it periodically, though in the depths of winter it could become damp and moldy. To add warmth, peasants layered rushes or old cloth over the straw. Wealthier peasants might have feather beds, but for most such comfort was unimaginable. One of the most effective ways to keep warm was simple people slept together. Entire families, sometimes including extended relatives, shared a single bed or a cluster of sleeping spaces pushed together. The heat of multiple bodies created a cocoon of warmth. Modesty was sacrificed in favor of survival. Parents, children, and grandparents all pressed close breathing in the same smoky air, wrapped in whatever coverings they could muster. It was a communal act of endurance, binding families in both hardship and affection. Livestock, too, contributed to warmth. In many cottages, animals were kept indoors during winter nights. The body heat of cows, goats, or pigs raised the temperature of the room sometimes by several degrees. The presence of animals also created a sense of security. The rhythmic breathing of a cow in the corner, the rustling of pigs in straw, these were the sounds of life reassuring in the silence of a frozen night. The fire was the heart of warmth, but it was fickle. Firewood was precious, and families could not afford to burn it constantly. Fires were often allowed to burn low during the night, with embers banked under ash to preserve heat until morning. Children might wake shivering when the flames died, huddling closer to parents for comfort. The fear of waking to a cold hearth was ever present, and rekindling a fire on a frigid morning was a dreaded chore. Candles and oil lamps provided a small measure of light but little warmth. Instead, warmth came from rituals, drinking warm broth before bed, sharing stories around the fire to delay the moment of lying down in the cold, singing or praying together to create a sense of inner heat. These intangible comforts were as important as physical coverings. The mind, soothed by rhythm and routine, endured better than one left to dwell on fear. The medieval peasant's ingenuity extended to small tricks. Heated stones were sometimes placed in the hearth, then wrapped in cloth and tucked into bedding as crude warmers. Pots filled with embers could be placed near the bed, though this carried the risk of fire. In regions with access to tile stoves, peasants enjoyed more sustained warmth, but these were rare luxuries. It is worth remembering that peasants' tolerance for cold was far greater than ours today. Generations grew accustomed to discomfort, their bodies hardened by exposure. Children grew up in chilly cottages, learning early to endure. What would freeze us to misery was for them the rhythm of life. Yet even hardened bodies sought comfort, and the nightly struggle for warmth was a shared experience that defined winter survival. In this part, we see that keeping warm was not a single act, but a layered defense: clothes, bedding, bodies pressed together, animals in the home, and the flickering fire. Each layer added a degree of safety against the relentless cold. Together they formed a fragile barrier between life and death. Nightly routines. Once the peasants had gathered fuel for the fire, eaten their evening meal, and prepared their bedding, the nightly routine began. For us today, nighttime might mean a continuation of activity under electric light. But for the medieval peasant, the night was a boundary, a curtain that brought work to a halt and demanded surrender to darkness. Peasants went to bed much earlier than modern people. Without lamps or electricity, the length of the day was governed entirely by the Sunday. In winter, with its long nights and short days, peasants might find themselves in bed soon after sunset. A meal of pottage or bread, perhaps a sip of ale, marked the end of the day's labor. The tools were set aside, animals tended, and doors barred against the cold and whatever dangers lurked outside. Yet their sleep was not like ours. Historians and researchers into medieval culture have noted the phenomenon of segmented sleep or two sleeps. Peasants often experienced a first sleep that lasted several hours, followed by a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night, and then a second sleep until dawn. During this interval, which might last an hour or two, people prayed, spoke quietly with family, tended the fire, or even visited neighbors. In winter, this interlude took place in near darkness. The first sleep was deep and restorative, a collapse into exhaustion after the day's toil. Bodies pressed together on straw beds, wrapped in cloaks, found warmth and comfort in closeness. Children often drifted to sleep quickly, lulled by the murmurs of parents or grandparents telling stories by the fire. The crackle of embers and the occasional howl of wind were the lullabies of the medieval night. The period of wakefulness, however, was a liminal time. Some believed that prayers offered in these quiet hours were especially powerful. Others used the time for intimate conversation, reflection, or even small household tasks like mending clothes or checking food stores. In villages, it was not unusual for a neighbor to knock softly during this interval, sharing news or seeking comfort. In this way, the medieval night was both private and communal, both fearful and strangely social. The second sleep carried families into dawn. It was often lighter, more fragmented as hunger stirred and the cold deepened toward morning. Many dreaded rising from bed, knowing the shock of the cold air that awaited. Children clung to blankets, reluctant to leave the small warmth of the communal bed. Parents urged them up for work, began as soon as light returned. The rooster's crow, the faint gray light through shutters, and the stirrings of animals marked the end of night. Night was not silent, far from it. The howl of wolves or dogs echoed across snowy fields. The creak of wooden beams in the wind reminded sleepers of the fragility of their homes. Within the cottage, the cough of a child, the murmur of a restless elder, or the shifting of livestock all contributed to the soundscape. These noises were ordinary, yet in the darkness they could also seem ominous. A knock at the door in the dead of night, a sound in the woods might be explained by superstition as easily as by nature. Religion played a role here too. The hours of darkness were believed to be times when spirits or demons wandered freely. Crosses were carved into doors, prayers spoken before lying down, charms hung near beds. Sleep was not only physical rest, but also a spiritual act of trust. To close one's eyes was to surrender oneself into God's keeping with hope that dawn would come again. Children experienced these routines with wonder and fear. The stories told by firelight of saints, of heroes, of witches filled their dreams. Their sense of time was shaped by rhythm: first sleep, wakeful pause, second sleep. These rhythms bonded families together, linking generations in a cycle that repeated through countless winters. In this part of our exploration, we see how the medieval night was far from empty. It was filled with ritual rhythm and meaning. The peasants' nightly routines reveal a world that accepted darkness, feared it, but also wove it into the fabric of life. For them, survival was not simply physical, but also cultural, spiritual, and communal. Food and energy for winter nights. In the medieval world, warmth did not come only from fire or clothing. It also came from within, from the food that sustained peasants through the long, cold months. The act of eating was not just nourishment, but survival itself, and every bite carried significance. During winter, when fields lay dormant and game was scarce, peasants relied on ingenuity and tradition to provide the calories and comfort needed to endure the coldest nights. The staple of the medieval peasant's diet was pottage, a thick soup or stew made from whatever ingredients were available. In winter, pottage often contained dried peas, beans, onions, cabbage, and grains like barley or oats. Sometimes small scraps of meat, bacon, or bones were added for flavor. The pot sat over the hearth, simmering throughout the day, and was eaten by dipping coarse bread into the broth. Pottage was versatile filling and warming a lifeline during months when variety was scarce. Bread was another essential. Dark, heavy loaves made from rye or barley were the daily fare. White bread made from refined wheat was reserved for the wealthy. For peasants, bread was not only food, but also utensil and plate used to scoop up stew or absorb juices. During harsh winters, when grain supplies dwindled, bread grew coarse, mixed with husks, acorns, or even ground peas to stretch the flour further. Despite its rough texture, it provided the energy peasants needed to work and to keep warm. Ale and beer were common drinks, even for children. Water was often unsafe and weak. Ale brewed at home was safer and provided warmth. It was low in alcohol but rich in calories, functioning as liquid bread. On the coldest nights, a sip of ale before bed was thought to ward off the chill, though in reality it provided more comfort than heat. Vegetables like turnips, parsnips, and carrots were stored in root cellars buried in sand or straw to keep them edible through winter. Cabbage, hardy and reliable, was a mainstay. Dried beans and peas-filled sacks hung from rafters. Meat was rare but preserved through salting or smoking. Fish, especially herring, was salted and stored an important source of protein in months when fresh catches were impossible. Dairy, milk, butter, and cheese added fat to the diet when animals still produced during the winter. The act of eating together was as important as the food itself. Families gathered around the hearth bowls in hand, sharing not only nourishment but warmth. The steam of hot soup filled the smoky air, offering both comfort and calories. Children were given the softest portions, the elderly the warmest, while parents often ate what remained. Sacrifice was part of survival. Stories abound of parents pretending to have eaten so their children could have more. Calories were crucial, for the body burned energy quickly in the cold. A diet heavy in grains, legumes, and fats kept peasants alive, though malnutrition was common. Winters of famine, when harvests failed, brought desperation. In such times, peasants turned to bark roots or whatever could be found. These were the winters when survival itself became uncertain, when every meal might be the last before hunger claimed another life. Rituals surrounded food. A prayer before meals was both spiritual and practical, a reminder of gratitude. Sharing food with neighbors in times of plenty ensured support in times of want. Leftovers were rare. Nothing was wasted. Bones were boiled until they yielded no more flavor. Stale bread was softened in broth. The economy of food was absolute. Food also carried symbolic warmth. Feasts during Christmas or other holy days provided more than calories. They gave hope-lifting spirits in the darkest time of the year. A roasted goose, a shared pie, or even sweetened bread might mark a rare occasion of abundance. These moments of festivity were remembered long after the last bite was gone, sustaining the spirit, if not the body. In this part of our journey, we see that food was not only sustenance, but also strategy. Every root stored, every loaf baked, every drop of ale brewed was a defense against the cold. The peasant's table was humble, but it was the foundation of survival. Without these meals, fragile though they were, no one would have lived to see the coming of spring. Community and religion survival in the medieval winter was not solely an individual or family matter. It was above all a communal endeavor. In villages where poverty was widespread and resources limited, the bonds of community were lifelines. And beyond community stood the institution of the church, whose presence shaped the rhythms of daily life and offered not only spiritual guidance, but practical relief. Neighbors depended on one another in countless ways. Gathering firewood, mending roofs, caring for livestock. These were tasks too heavy for one household alone. During winter, when the cold threatened to isolate families, collaboration became vital. Stories from medieval records describe neighbors helping each other beat snow off thatched roofs, sharing embers when fires went out, or pooling food when famine loomed. The gift of a loaf of bread or a bundle of straw was not charity but survival shared. The communal oven found in many villages was an example of shared resource. Bread was baked there for multiple families, saving fuel and labor. In winter, the oven itself became a gathering point, a source of warmth as much as nourishment. The rhythm of baking, the scent of loaves, the chatter of villagers waiting together, all these created a sense of unity. Religion infused every aspect of winter life. The church calendar marked time with holy days and feasts that broke the monotony of cold and darkness. Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, each carried rituals of light hope and communal joy. In these celebrations, peasants found not only spiritual comfort but also physical sustenance. Lords and monasteries often provided alms, meals, or warm clothing during feast days. For the poorest, these were lifelines as critical as any stored root or sack of grain. Churches themselves were sanctuaries. Their stone walls provided shelter and their rituals provided meaning. On the coldest nights, when fear of death by freezing was real, peasants gathered to pray for protection. The flicker of candles, the chant of hymns, and the shared warmth of bodies created a spiritual hearth. Faith taught them that suffering was temporary, that endurance was virtue, and that salvation awaited those who persevered. Festivals in winter served more than a religious function. They were psychological relief moments when laughter, song, and dance dispelled the gloom. The Feast of Fools, the ringing in of the New Year, and the Carnival before Lent all gave peasants reason to gather to forget hardship, if only briefly. These occasions reminded the community that joy, too, was a kind of survival. The role of monasteries was particularly important. Monks and nuns tended the sick, distributed food, and provided shelter. Their cloisters stored knowledge about agriculture, preservation, and remedies. During famine years, monasteries opened their granaries, sometimes saving entire villages from starvation. Religion was not only a matter of prayer, but of practical sustenance. At the same time, winter deepened spiritual reflection. Long nights encouraged prayer and contemplation. Families whispered psalms during their wakeful hours between the first and second sleep. Charms and blessings were sought to protect against evil spirits believed to roam freely in the dark. Faith anchored the mind against despair, making the unbearable more bearable. In this part of the story, we see that peasants survived not alone, but together through the solidarity of neighbors, the rituals of the church, and the strength of shared belief. Winter tested not only their bodies, but their communities. And in the warmth of cooperation and faith, they found resilience greater than the sum of their individual struggles. Dangers of winter nights. Winter in the medieval world was not simply uncomfortable, it was deadly. The dangers faced by peasants during the coldest nights were many, and each carried the threat of devastation. To understand their endurance, we must also understand the perils that haunted them once the sun set and the cold deepened. The most obvious danger was exposure to cold itself. Frostbite and hypothermia were constant threats, though peasants did not use those terms. They knew the signs: numbness, shivering that gave way to stillness, skin that turned pale or blackened. A child left too far from the fire, an elder unable to generate warmth, a traveler caught outside after dark, all could succumb before dawn. Many families knew the grief of waking to find a loved one cold and lifeless. Illness was another specter of winter. Colds, fevers, and respiratory diseases flourished in smoky, damp cottages. Without chimneys, the constant inhalation of smoke weakened lungs. Influenza, pneumonia, and other infections spread quickly in close quarters. Malnutrition lowered resistance, making even minor sickness lethal. The night when bodies were weakest and warmth scarce was often the time when illness claimed its victims. Livestock so crucial to survival were equally vulnerable. A freezing night could kill sheep, pigs, or chickens, depriving families of food, wool, and income. Desperate peasants brought animals inside their cottages, but even then, disease or cold sometimes claimed them. The loss of a cow was a catastrophe not only for milk, but for the warmth it provided when kept indoors. Each night, peasants prayed not only for their children, but also for their animals. Famine was the long shadow of winter. When stores ran low, the fear of starvation grew acute. Night magnified this fear, as empty stomachs made sleep difficult. Parents sometimes whispered reassurances to children while secretly wondering how many more meals remained. The danger of hunger was not only physical but psychological. a slow erosion of hope that gnawed as surely as the cold itself. Superstition deepened the terrors of the night. Peasants believed that darkness was the hour of spirits, demons, and witches. The wind moaning through the rafters was said to be the voices of the restless dead. Shadows flickering in firelight became omens. Tales of the wild hunt of spectral riders sweeping across the sky circulated in villages, told by parents to warn children not to wander after dark. These beliefs made the night a landscape of dread as well as cold. Bandits and wolves were real dangers too. A knock at the door after midnight might signal a thief seeking plunder. In forests, packs of wolves prowled the edges of villages, their eyes glowing in the dark, their howls echoing across snow. A child sent out to fetch water, a shepherd caught late in the fields, both were vulnerable. The darkness concealed threats both imagined and real. The fire itself carried risk. Sparks could leap from the hearth, igniting thatch and turning a home into a death trap. Families went to sleep praying the embers would hold until morning, but not blaze into catastrophe. The delicate balance between warmth and safety was a nightly gamble. And then there was despair. The psychological burden of winter nights was heavy. Weeks without sunlight, endless hunger, and the constant cold wore down spirits. Depression and hopelessness, though unnamed, were felt keenly. Songs, prayers, and stories were not mere pastimes, but defenses against despair. To lose hope was as dangerous as losing food or fire. In this part, we see the medieval night for what it truly was, a gauntlet of dangers. Cold disease, hunger, predators, spirits, and despair all converged in the hours between sunset and dawn. That peasants survived it all is proof of resilience of faith and of an unyielding will to endure. Conclusion and reflection. As we reach the end of our journey into the cold nights of the medieval peasant, it is worth pausing to reflect. We have walked through cottages of wattle and daub, crouched beside smoky hearths, pulled rough cloaks tighter around our shoulders, and shared the breath of cattle in the dark. We have felt the bite of frost, the gnawing of hunger, the weight of fear, and the flicker of hope. Now let us step back and consider what all of this means not only for the people of the past, but for us today. The peasants who survived those winters did so with resources far more limited than ours. No central heating, no electric light, no endless shelves of food. Their homes were fragile, their diets monotonous, their nights filled with danger. And yet, they endured. Through resilience, community, faith, and sheer will, they crossed the threshold of winter to see the return of spring. Their endurance is a testament to the strength of the human spirit when tested by nature at its harshest. When we compare their lives to ours, the contrast is stark. Today, a flick of a switch banishes darkness, a turn of a dial summons heat, and supermarkets overflow with abundance. We sleep alone in warm beds, shielded from the cold by walls and insulation. Rarely do we fear that the night might kill us before dawn. This comfort, so easily taken for granted, is a luxury unimaginable to medieval peasants. To recognize this is to recognize how extraordinary our age of comfort truly is. Yet in our comfort, something may have been lost. The closeness of family, the bond of community, the rhythm of life tied to nature, all were stronger in the medieval village than in our modern lives. Huddled together for warmth, peasants shared not only body heat but also stories, prayers, and love. The very act of survival bound them together. In darkness and danger, they discovered intimacy and resilience that our isolated, climate-controlled lives rarely replicate. Reflection also reminds us of humility. The peasants were not weak, nor were they primitive in spirit. They were human beings like us, with dreams, fears, and hopes. Their strategies for survival, though simple, were ingenious. Their ability to endure hardship without surrender is worthy of admiration. To dismiss their lives as mere struggle is to overlook the profound lessons they offer: gratitude for what we have respect for, resilience, and the reminder that comfort is never guaranteed. As we close this story, imagine again the scene: a small cottage, the fire dying to embers, the breath of children mingling in the cold air, the faint sound of wind beyond the walls. Outside, the night is merciless. Inside, life clings stubbornly to warmth. Against all odds, they survive. And in their survival, we find inspiration. For those listening tonight, perhaps as you drift towards sleep, consider the peasants who once lay in darkness, their lives balanced between cold and hope. Let their endurance soothe your own worries. Let their story remind you of strength hidden within. And let their memory carry you into rest as the past gently whispers, "You are warm, you are safe, and dawn will come again."